So tonight we're going to be going through verses 43 through 54, and I'm just going to let you know, like tonight, I don't know about you guys, but I've talked to a lot of people, tonight too, throughout this week and tonight, that are just, gosh darn tired. They're exhausted. And I am one of those people. And there was a number of things that happened this week that I'm going to share with you guys. I'm going to be pretty transparent with you and some of the things that I have experienced and some of the things that I was feeling this week, because I think it's important, man. I think God allows things to happen in our lives, which we'll talk about tonight, for the betterment of other people. Like a lot of us in this room have experienced pain. Everyone in this room has experienced pain, has experienced suffering, has experienced suck. And that is for a reason. Man, God doesn't, I'm getting way ahead of myself right now. Let's go into the passage and let's go in order of what's happening. Sorry, we're feeling it right now. Let's go. Verse 43. After the 2 days, so this is the 2 days that Jesus spent in Samaria. So after the 2 days, he departed for Galilee. For Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in his own hometown. So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, having seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the feast, for they too had gone to the feast. So if you guys don't remember what Jesus was planning on doing before he met with the woman in Samaria, they were in Judea and they were traveling to Galilee. Galilee and Judea's on the southern end, Galilee's on the northern end, and right smack in the middle of Samaria. Jews would travel around Samaria to get to Galilee because they hated Samaritans. But Jesus said, no, again, I'm not about your stupid cultural discriminations. I'm going to go through Samaria because I got someone I need to talk to. So anyways, Jesus goes to Samaria. He spends 2 days there, and then he heads over to Galilee. And verse 44, talking about Jesus testifying that a prophet has no honor in his own hometown, it's saying that because Jesus is actually from Galilee. Nazareth, well, he was born, and okay, all right, you started this, so let's just finish it. He was born in Bethlehem, obviously, which is in Judea. He was born in Bethlehem, and then after he was born in Bethlehem, an angel came to Joseph and told Joseph to take Mary and Jesus and flee to Egypt, because Herod, the king, learned, if you guys remember the story in Luke, right? The wise men come to Herod. They tell him about the prophecy of a new king. Herod gets super upset about that, and he's like, hey, go tell me when you find the new king so I can worship him too, with the mindset of, okay, as soon as I find out who this king is, I'm going to kill him. So when the wise men don't come back to Herod, Herod gets ticked off and he decides, you know what? I'm just going to kill every male baby that is 2 years old and younger in that region. So he sends out a decree and kills every male baby that is 2 years old and younger. But the angel came to Joseph and Mary and told them to flee to Egypt. So they fled to Egypt while this was happening in Judea. And then after that, after Herod dies, they go back. They're planning initially to go back to Judea, but then an angel tells them to go to Nazareth, which is in Galilee. So then they go to Galilee, and that in Nazareth, which is we've talked about it before, but Nazareth was kind of a hick town. It was not where the social elites were raised. It was like in the country, they're doing man stuff, they're doing woman stuff, they're living on their own, they're living on the land. That was Nazareth. When people found out that Jesus was that Jesus was a Nazarene, and they heard the wisdom that came out of his mouth, people were blown away. They're like, what? How is this guy so smart? He's from Nazareth. But anyways, so Jesus is going back to Galilee, which is the region that he's from, and it says that the Galileans welcomed him, having seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the feast. So if you guys remember back, and if you guys missed any of these teachings that I'm referring to, you can go to YouTube and you can watch them. But if you remember back, Jesus, during the Passover feast, that's where Jesus was flipping tables and whipping people and animals and going crazy. And so Jesus did that in front of thousands of Jews, right? Jews from all over the known world would travel to Jerusalem during the Passover feast. And that is where Jesus flipped tables and made this huge scene, essentially telling people and showing people that what the church was doing was not how the Pharisees were conducting church and relating to God. They were way off. They were way wrong. They had turned it into some selfish religion, and Jesus is essentially telling people, no, this is not how you relate to God. And then in that same time, he does all kinds of signs and wonders and he heals people. So the Galileans welcome him probably because they want to see Jesus do some more signs and wonders. And we know that because of the context. But anyways, let's go to verse 46. It says, so he came to Cana, this is Jesus, he came again to Cana in Galilee where he had made the water wine. We talked about that a while ago too, where Jesus went to, I just feel like we're doing all kinds of recap right now, but Semper send it. Jesus went to this wedding feast back in the day with some disciples. Wedding feast back in the day lasted a long time, sometimes up to a week. And so Jesus goes with his disciples, but they run out of wine at the wedding celebration. And that is extremely embarrassing for the groom and for the bridegroom. And somehow Mary knew about this. She was probably a close family friend. And she talks to Jesus and she's like, Jesus, they ran out of wine. And Jesus is like, okay, Mary, I know what you're doing. Like, okay. Jesus goes and he uses these jars. There's these jars for purification, which is what the women would use to cleanse themselves and essentially make themselves pure before the wedding celebration. Jesus tells these servants to fill those up with water, and then he tells a servant to take some of that water to the head of the feast, and so he does it. And then the head of the feast, man, this dude drinks this wine, and he's like, hold up, what is going on right now? And he goes to, I think he goes to the groom, he goes to someone, and he says, man, people always serve the best wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then they throw out that cheap stuff, right? Then they throw out, what are some cheap wines? Barefoot. Did you say barefoot? Barefoot. Then they throw out the barefoot, right? But this dude drinks this trash, and he goes and he's like, you did the opposite. Man, you saved the best wine for now. And in that teaching, we talked about how difficult and how much time it takes in order to create a good quality wine. It's insane how much it takes and how much time and quality ingredients and soil and grapes and there's all these different things that come into play to make a quality wine. And Jesus does it instantaneously. And so what that essentially shows us, man, is that what Jesus, and this is kind of a theme we've been seeing with Jesus throughout all this, is that what Jesus has to offer, man, is so much better than what this world has to offer. The wine that Jesus had to offer was better than the highest quality wine that they were serving at the feast. What Jesus has to offer us, and the same thing with the woman at Samaria, what you're coming and getting this water from the well, man, I am here to give you living water. The disciples were trying to give him food, and he's like, no, dude, my food is to do the will of my Father who sent me. Jesus is always revealing to people like, hey, what I have to offer you is so much better than what you are trying to find satisfaction and pleasure in. That is what Jesus is constantly communicating. So now we come to the second part of verse 46, and it says, and at Capernaum, there was an official whose son was ill. So this word official in the Greek means royal person or an officer or minister to a prince. So this guy was a very important person, and this dude had very significant authority in this region. Man, this was an important guy, and this dude travels from Capernaum to Cana, which is about 16 to 18 miles. So this dude, and back then, obviously, they're not just hopping in the car and driving 10 minutes and bam, he's there. This dude is traveling, probably with multiple people, to get over to Cana. So this could have taken as little as 6 hours for the dude to get there, maybe longer. But he wants to have a conversation with Jesus. Well, he wants more than that. We'll see in verse 47, it says, when this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So this gives some context as to why this father was willing to do something like that. This extremely important person that had all kinds of authority and say in this region was willing to travel down to have a conversation with a carpenter from Nazareth, because he was desperate. Man, his son was sick, and he believed and thought, and his son probably was going to die. His son was at the point of death. And I don't know, I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room that don't fully understand what that feels like. But I'm sure you have some kind of idea. Maybe it was a family member or a friend or a niece or a nephew that you've experienced this with. But a few months ago, I experienced something similar to this with my 3-year-old son. So he woke up one night and he started having this barking cough. If you guys know what croup is, my son gets croup really bad. And he had just started that same night. He had it was one cough right before he went to bed. And so we're just oh man, he's gonna have croup and this sucks. But we went to bed, and a couple hours later at 1 a.m, my son wakes up and we just hear this moaning sound. So I get up and I go into the hallway, and my son is standing there, and he's trying to cry, but he can't cry. And he's trying to talk, but he can't talk. His airway had become so irritated that he could barely breathe. And so I run into my room, I get ready, I grab my son, I put him in my car, and I start speeding down to the St. Joseph's ER, and I freaking called 911, and I was I'm just letting you know that I am going from Pantano and Broadway, and I am not gonna follow the speed limit. I'm not gonna stop at a red light if there's no cars. I am getting my son to the ER right now. And I was just looking back at my son, and I was just telling him breathe, baby, keep breathing. And I was just praying to God, just God, please do not take my baby boy right now. Please do not take my son. And got to the hospital, parked in a handicapped spot right in front of a cop, run into the room with my son, and I'm just asking people to help because my son can't breathe. And it took way flipping longer than I felt like it should have taken for them to get my son back there. And but they got him a nebulizer, and he did a session of that. They gave him this super strong liquid steroid. And after that, he started to talk again in this super high, squeaky voice, which was really cute. But it was, obviously it's not a great, but anyways, he's talking again. And then he started getting his personality a little bit and was talking to me and asking me questions. And then 4 hours later, we did another session of the nebulizer, and then they sent us home 4 hours later. And so I can't imagine. And as I was driving home, I was just thanking God. I was God, thank you so much that I live in a time that I know that there is a place that I can go to that my son will get help immediately. So I can't imagine putting myself in this father's shoes, what this father is feeling and experiencing, because I'm sure that he had, knowing the position he was in, I guarantee you he exhausted everything that he could possibly use his influence for or his money for, all of the specialists in that day to help his son, and no one was helping his son, and his son was just getting worse and worse. So I can't imagine what this father is feeling. But he had heard rumors about Jesus. He had heard rumors about this guy that does miracles, that heals people. And so he decides, man, out of desperation, I am going to make that journey, that 6-hour journey, to potentially find this guy and try to get him to come to my house and save my son. And so he goes to Jesus, and what does he ask him? It says he went to Jesus and he asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So he essentially asked him, he says, Jesus, my son is about to die. I need you to come with me to my home in Capernaum and heal my son. And Jesus, when he asked this question, I guarantee you that he was filled with fear, that he was filled with anxiety, he was filled with emotion in this experience, in this conversation with Jesus. But Jesus gives him a really interesting response in verse 48. Jesus said to him, Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. It's like, Jesus, are you serious? Like, this dude is literally asking you to come heal his son, and this is how you're responding to him? Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. I cannot imagine what this father is thinking and the different thoughts that are firing off in his mind from this response from Jesus. It's like, dude, this guy is not the kind of guy that gets no answers from nobodies like Jesus. Jesus socially is a nobody. This dude is a royal official. This guy is probably thinking, what is going on right now? I'm sure he was expecting Jesus, the nice, compassionate Jesus, to be like, okay, all right, come on, let's go. Let's go do this. But that's not what Jesus says. Like I said before, this man, I'm sure he was filled with fear and anxiety and emotion, and he was asking Jesus to come to his home and heal his son. But what Jesus is doing with this statement is he is addressing something that is underneath the surface. He is addressing something in this man's life that is so much deeper than him just healing this man's son. Because as we're going to find out, this man doesn't really believe in Jesus. This father, in his desperation, is trying to find a way to help his son. He doesn't fully believe in Jesus. The kind of people that fully believe in Jesus, man, you can read about, I think it's in Luke chapter 7, but there's this Roman centurion that when you look at how he responds to Jesus and the things that he says to Jesus and asks Jesus to do, that man truly believed in Jesus. And it says in that story that Jesus is astonished at that man's faith, but this guy is not like that. Jesus, man, in this back and forth with this guy, he's calm, he's collected, and he uses this as an opportunity, man, to challenge and to grow and to open the eyes of this father. Verse 49, the official said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." The title that this guy gives Jesus is Kyrios, which is a person who has power in deciding, a master or a lord. So now we're getting a full understanding of this dude's desperation. This man obviously is socially way higher than Jesus, but now he is humbling himself to a place to calling Jesus sir, calling him Kyrios. And then another thing is the way that the ESV version translate this is they put a period at the end of this statement. And a lot of the translations, many translators put an exclamation point at the end of this, which obviously changes the way that you read it in your mind. He is begging Jesus to come to his house and to heal his son. He has decided in his mind not only what he wants Jesus to do, but how he wants Jesus to do it. In his mind, he has decided and come up with this reality, this expectation that the way for Jesus to heal his son is for Jesus to travel to his house and come to his son and then heal his son. That's his expectation for Jesus. That is how he has decided that Jesus is going to work. But then we see something. We see Jesus do something in verse 50, the beginning. Jesus said to him, "Go, your son will live." Obviously, Jesus has compassion for this man, but Jesus is also showing this man that Jesus doesn't work on man's terms. God doesn't work on our terms. He doesn't do what we want him to do and how we want him to do it. Isaiah 55:9 says, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." So what is Jesus essentially saying to this father? He's telling him, I am going to heal your son, but I am not going to do it your way. You are going to have to trust me in the way that I choose to do it. And he also gives this dad, man, a call to action. He tells him to go. He says, go, your son will live. So this dad has to leave Jesus, leave the only person, I'm sure, man, I can't imagine, again, trying to put myself in this man's shoes, but he has to leave the person that he was hoping would come to his home and heal his son. He's probably walking away from this thinking, man, my son is probably going to die. But he has to exercise this act of faith. In verse 50b, it says, the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. It says that he believed the word that Jesus spoke, but as we read on this story, we know that he wasn't fully convinced. We know he didn't really believe. He believed enough to go back home, but I'm sure that this man was hopeful. I'm sure that he was hopeful that Jesus was going to heal his son, but he was not fully convinced. Verse 51 says, and as he was going down, his servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. And this is just a grace of God right here. He didn't even have to make it all the way back to his house before finding out that his son, the fever had left him, and that his son is getting better and progressing. That is just a beautiful grace of God. But in verse 52 and 53, it says, so he asked them the hour when he began to get better. And they said to him, yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. And the father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son will live. What is this father's response? And just another thing that I find really interesting about this, Jesus saying, go, your son will live. Jesus didn't tell him, go, I'm healing your son right now. Go, your son is better right now. He just tells him, go, your son will live. He doesn't even tell him when his son is going to get better. And that's another thing a lot of us want from Jesus, right? It's like, all right, Jesus, I understand that you have promises for me. I understand that you've put these desires in me that I have for my future, but when the heck is it going to happen? Jesus doesn't work on our terms. Jesus works on his terms. But anyway, this father's first response isn't, of course, he's better. Man, Jesus said he was going to be better. No, he is freaking out and celebrating and then starts doing detective work to figure out, man, was it really Jesus? Was it really Jesus that healed my son? And he figures out, yes, it was Jesus. And then the second part of 53, this is when his belief fully comes. It says, and he himself believed, right? But didn't he just believe earlier? No, he believed enough to go. He believed enough to take a step of faith, but he wasn't fully convinced. Now this man is fully convinced. Now this man believes. You could say that he believed before again, but that was a hopeful belief. But this man now is fully convinced that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. He is fully convinced that Jesus is in fact the Son of God. So much so that he begins to share his testimony with his household, and his whole household is convinced and believes wholly that Jesus is in fact the Messiah, that Jesus is in fact the Son of God. And again, we talked about testimonies before. This man's testimony, not his theology, not his wittiness, not his doctrinal knowledge, while all of those things are important, obviously, but people are getting saved like crazy in the gospel simply from people's testimonies. Man, people get saved constantly from people's stories, from people's testimonies, from your stories. So don't think that you need to be some crazy apologist. I was going to say apologeticist. That's not a word. Some crazy apologist, right? Knowing the answer to every question that any person can possibly give you. That's the only time I can open my mouth and talk to someone about Jesus. I have to know all the answers to all the questions. Well, guess what? You're probably never going to talk to someone about Jesus then, because it's impossible. But your story, your testimony, the things that God has done in your life that are unexplainable, man, those things people relate with and people connect with. And people get changed by that. man, people understand that and they are transformed, and it opens people's eyes in a new way to the beauty of the truth of the gospel. Because it's not just some intellectual thing, man. It is a very personal, emotional, spiritual thing. So don't play down the power of your testimony. Maybe some of you in this room are like this official. Man, maybe you came here just because you are hoping that this Jesus dude is legit. That this Jesus guy actually is who he says he is. Man, maybe you're hoping that Jesus is going to fill this desperate need that you have, like this man and his son. Maybe you have something specific in your life that you want Jesus to fix, and you have it played out in your head how you want him to fix it, how you want him to go about getting you that need that you believe that you have. Jesus in this story is teaching us that we can trust him with our needs. We can trust him with our desires. And what he calls us to do is to humble ourselves and take a step of faith. But what we need to do, because we're human beings, right? Our minds are crazy. Our creativity is insane. We can come up with so many wild, false realities about the future. Like, we do it constantly. Man, Stephen was just sharing this at our book club not too long ago, how like guys have this ability to see a girl at a coffee shop, this really beautiful, attractive girl, and then all of a sudden they see the next 50 years with her. And it's like, oh my goodness, this is it. This is what's happening. It's like, dude, you haven't even talked to her yet. This girl might be married with kids. You don't even know. But you've created this false reality in your mind that this is it. This is what it's going to look like. This is how it's going to happen. We all do that all the time. We come up, our creativity is crazy, and we think things, our brains are insane. But what we need to do is we need to learn to hold these, and we need to do this with our relationships. We need to do this with our degrees that we're trying to get. We need to do this with our jobs that we're trying to get. We need to do this with every aspect of our life, is hold it with an open hand. Because there are some things that we go about and we say, all right, God, these are the things that you can touch. These are the things that you can change in my life, right? I'm having a really hard time getting a relationship, so I'm going to give that one to you. But my job, I like my job, so I'm going to hold on to that. You can't touch my job. What job I'm going to have and how much money I make, I'm going to leave that up to you. But my degree, no, I've already spent 2 years on my degree. Like, that's not time I'm wasting. No, you can't touch that, Jesus. But whatever happens after my degree, that you can touch. We need to learn to hold every aspect of our lives with open hands. And if you have decided, Jesus, that is untouchable, you can't touch that part of me, then I can just tell you right now, being real with you, that's an idol in your life. That is something that you have put above God. God, this thing is more important than you, so you cannot touch it. You are below this thing. And that sounds harsh when you say it out loud, but that's the reality of what it is. That's what an idol is you saying, God, that's untouchable. We need to learn that we can trust Jesus with our needs. We can trust Jesus with our desires. And we need to humble ourselves, man, and take a step of faith. And this is the other thing, man, that I want to communicate to you guys is you don't have to be fully convinced to take a step of faith. You don't have to know exactly what's going to happen in the future to take a step of faith, man. This dude was not fully convinced, yet he took a step of faith. Abraham wasn't fully convinced in the promises of God, yet he took a step of faith. Man, David wasn't fully convinced in the promises of God, yet he took a step of faith. Man, in my own personal life, I wasn't fully convinced that the Marine Corps is where God wanted me to go. But I was pretty sure that was where God was leading me. I was convinced enough. And I was like, all right, God, if this is what you want, we will take a step, and I say we because I was married at the time, and when you're making a decision like that, like obviously it's not just going to affect me. It affected my wife probably more so than me. But anyways, we're going to take this step of faith and see what you do. And so we started the process, and God just, made it so obvious every step of the way that was what he called us to do. Moving back to Tucson, man, just being straight up and honest with you guys, we were really doubting that. We were really doubting getting out of the Marine Corps at all, and then really doubting moving back to Tucson. But God gave us just enough to be like, I am pretty sure that is where God is calling us, so we're going to take a step of faith. I didn't have a job. My second son was born a month before I got out of the Marine Corps. I didn't have a job up until after my son was born. So I had less than a month. And all these is just the way that God works. Like there was all these jobs that I was ready to apply for, but I had to be ready to work within 60 days. As soon as that time frame came for me to apply to these jobs, none of them are available. And I'm like, well, that sucks. But all right, God, if this is where you want us to go, we're going to go, knowing that you will provide. Wasn't fully convinced whatsoever. And then this position here was offered to me 2 days after my son was born, and it was just like, man, that's crazy how God works things out. And then, dude, on top of that, I don't think I've ever shared this with you guys before. They didn't even tell me what I was going to do when I was here. I literally got here my first day on the job. Robert Furrow, he's the main pastor of this church. In the staff meeting, I'm sitting there, and he's like, oh, guys, this is JD. He's going to be part of our pastoral staff, and we're not sure what he's going to do yet. And I was like, what is happening right now? And then they brought me into a meeting afterwards, and they're like, okay, we want you to oversee the small groups at our church, and then we want you to oversee Ignition. And I was like, dang, that's crazy, because that is exactly where my heart is. Like, that is exactly where I feel like God is calling me to. But again, weren't convinced at all. Just convinced enough to take a step of faith, and guess what? Jesus has come through every single time. You don't have to be fully convinced to take that step of faith, but when you take that step of faith, and in hindsight, you look back on your life, you realize the fingerprints of God in every step of that way. Man, God honors that step of faith. And now, I'm just going to be like pretty real and transparent with you guys about this week and how I just felt like it was so interesting that this was the passage that God had me teaching this week. Because for those of you that were here last week, my wife's birthday was last Saturday. And so we went up to the White Mountains. And on Saturday, on her birthday, Judah, my older son that we took to the ER earlier this year, started getting sick and started showing symptoms of the croup and everything that he goes through. So we have this steroid that we're prescribed that we usually, when we start seeing symptoms, we'll give it to him that night before he goes to bed. And then by the next day, he's doing like a lot better, and then he just progressively gets better. But we gave him the steroid, and the next day he was worse. And so it's like, okay, that's weird. We came back home, gave him the steroid again that night, and I slept in the room with him because he was like doing his wheezing thing, like coughing and like having a hard time breathing. And so we're like, okay, he's got to be better tomorrow, because there's no way that giving him this like twice in a row that he's going to be fine. The next day, he's worse on Monday. So then it was like, okay, we need to take this kid to the doctor. So we took him to the doctor, and we find out, my wife gives me a call, and I'm on speaker, like listening to the doctor, and she tells us that my son has asthma, and he's on like day 3 of an asthma attack. And hearing that, like, crushed me. Like, obviously, it's like, that is my son. Like, that is my baby boy. And like I talked about before, how our minds play out these realities of the future. Like, the first thing I thought about was Levi Lusko. If you guys don't know who Levi Lusko is he's one of the pastors, like kind of under the umbrella of Calvary in a church in Montana. And a lot of years ago, his 5-year-old daughter was at her grandma and grandpa's house, had an asthma attack, and they got to the house right as it was happening, and she ended up dying in his arms, in her dad's freaking arms. And like that's literally the first thing that comes into my mind after I hear that my son is like diagnosed with asthma. And because, man, our freaking minds, dude. But like I just want my son, right? My 3-year-old son, it's like I just want him to live. And he is, like, now that we're learning more and we're getting more educated in it, but it's just like these thoughts of like, man, I just want my 3-year-old to be able to run around and play and fight like he always wants to. I don't know where he gets the fighting from. Probably my wife, but I'm just kidding. But I just want to be able to do that stuff and have fun, man, be a 3-year-old kid. And I have this, what is it? Like this, I want my son to live the best life that I can think of. That's what I want. But it's not up to me, right? I am not God. I'm not in control of all things. God, he is God. And he is in control of all things. And he did, in reality, allow this to happen. But in Romans 8:28, he promises that he will work all things together for good to those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose. So I know that he will use this for good. I know that he will use this for the good of my son. I know he will use this for the good of me and my wife. And I know that he will use this for the good of others because I have experienced it so much in my life. And this is something I need to remind myself of when that fear and that anxiety starts kicking in. This is the promise that I always go to. And when something like this happens, it's like I remind myself of this passage, man, God works all things together for good. And then, obviously, as I come to study this week, this is the passage that we're studying. Man, a desperate father coming to Jesus and asking him to heal his son. And the father, man, not fully believing, but hoping, God, please heal my son, taking it a step of faith, and then God doing what he does and saving his boy. And it's like I ask, and the questions we ask ourselves when like reading this is like, man, do I really believe and trust in Jesus, man? Or am I that kind of person that needs to see signs and wonders in order to fully believe, like Jesus talked about? But when I look at my life, when I go back and relive my testimony, my story, my walk with God, God has done so many signs and wonders in my life and used so many things that I didn't even think it were possible for him to use as good for the good. Man, when I was 20 years old, and if you guys were here when me and my wife shared our testimony of how we got together and everything, man, God used my selfishness and my immaturity, my unwillingness, my inability to commit to someone. And he used that by, one, putting me in a season of singleness and having to learn what it means to be a man, what it means to love, and what it means to commit. And then commit to someone who hated my gosh darn guts. I decided I was gonna marry my wife when she hated me. She didn't want anything to do to me, rightfully so. And I was a floozy. I talked to her for a little bit, a little flirting here, a little flirting there, and then started dating someone else like right behind her back, and it was like, dang, that's messed up. So obviously she hates my guts, right? That's what a normal person would do. But, she did hate my guts for a long time, but anyways, God used that to grow me. And God, I love sharing our story because it's crazy how God worked on my wife's heart, right? And humbled her and opened her eyes. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I love our story is so awesome. There was one time, this is a rabbit trail, but there was one time I was sharing our story with a bunch of Marines at combat training. It's like 1 a.m, and we were just like waiting for everyone to be done at the range. And I start sharing this story with like 3 Marines. By the time I'm done with this story, there was literally like 50 Marines around me listening. They're like, no way that happened. I'm like, dude, it happened. Dude, our first kiss, oh man, I can't even get into that. Like, we ended up in the ER after my first kiss, but that's a story for another time. Crazy stuff. But God used that for the good. God used, and this is something that's crazy. Man, talk about like a swing in how this is going to go. But God even used my addiction to pornography for the good. Because now, man, being in the position that I am in, all of us in this room know how crazy our culture is, know how sexualized our culture is. And I guarantee you, there are so many people in this room that are addicted to pornography secretly. Man, obviously, you don't want to tell anybody about it. You're in church right now. You got to hide it. You got to act like that's not something that I actually do. That's not something I look at. No, that's not something I do. But through that, through me having to go through that, I understand. I completely get and can empathize with people who are struggling with that, who are wrestling with that. I know what goes on in your mind. I know the kind of condemnation that comes. I know the kind of pain, the suffering that it creates. I know what it's like, man, to feel lonely or something, and then that's the place that you go and you feel like trash afterwards, and you keep trying to fight it, but you feel like you can't tell anybody about it. I got to fight this on my own, but you keep failing and failing and failing and failing. I know what that's like. And God has used that for the good. So now I can come alongside brothers in Christ, man, and sisters too. We've got a girls group too that talks about this. We've got a dudes group chat and a girls group chat for people that struggle with this. And it's like, dude, I can resonate and completely understand and have so much like empathy and compassion for these people. And I like know I know what it's like to fight that fight and how hard it is and how great it is when you have brothers coming alongside you and fighting that fight with you. So God has even used my sick addiction for the good. That's how good God is. Isn't that insane? It's insane that our God can turn around some sick, twisted things that we've done in our past and use them for the good. God has the same thing with, he had a purpose for my joining the Marine Corps. He had a purpose for us going to North Carolina. He had a purpose for me and my wife struggling with infertility for 2 years. He had a purpose for us losing our first baby in a miscarriage. He used all of these things that, don't get me wrong, sucked in the moment. The vast majority of them. Moving to North Carolina kind of sucked because we had to drive a U-Haul across the country, and that was terrible. But these things that were really difficult and sucked, and you're just like, God, why are you allowing this to happen? Why is this happening? Standing here now, looking back through all of these things that he allowed us to go through, I have seen how he has used that for my good, to strengthen and solidify my faith in my relationship with him, how he has used that for the good of me and my wife, bringing us closer together and strengthening our relationship, and then using that for the good of others, man, getting to empathize and relate and understand where people are at and understand where people are going through when they're going through hard, difficult things, because everybody in this room goes through hard, difficult things. So I know for a fact that he has a purpose for my son's asthma. I know for a fact that he has a purpose for my younger son's growth disorder that we don't even know what it is yet, which is just a whole nother thing. But we know, we can be confident in the fact, I can be confident in the fact that God is going to use those things for the good, because when I look at his track record, it's perfect. He uses all things, not some things. He uses all things. He works all things together for the good to those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose, because God is good. God is loving. God is faithful, and he loves you, and he loves me, and he loves my boys more than I even love them, which blows my mind. And he will work all things together for the good.